Welcome once again to this video lecture in family communication. In a previous video, we talked about some of the things that make family communication unique. In this video, we'll continue that project and talk about other dynamics that research has discovered that makes communication in the family context really unique compared to other contexts. Perhaps you've had this happen in your past. You're having a conversation with your parents, and you have a memory of something that happened back when you were in 6th grade. Your parents, however, have a different memory of the exact same event. So, for instance, you might remember the science contest, the science fair that occurred in 6th grade, and in your memory, you worked on that project almost all by yourself, hour after hour, and the project didn't do well. Your parents, however, remember it differently. They remember helping you a fair bit with that project. They remember you getting frustrated and walking away at times. In fact, your mom said at one point she felt as if the project was more her project than your project. That led to a conflict between you and your parents over the science project. You were convinced you were right. Your parents, well, they were convinced that they were right. This is another of the many dynamics that make family communication unique. It's what researcher Jesse Delia refers to as selective memory. Now, surely in other contexts, people have selective memories. So, for instance, you and your friends might have differing memories of what prom was like your senior year of high school. But comparatively speaking, family contexts feature far more different disputes and far more different permutations of selective memory than any other kind of a context. A moment ago, I mentioned researcher Jesse Delia, and Delia's research has consistently shown that people overestimate the accuracy of their own memories. People are just absolutely convinced that their memory of a particular event is accurate. Research suggests that's not often the case, and while we can't put a precise number on it, most research studies find that our memories are only accurate about 60% of the time. Now that leads, as you might imagine, to a number of challenges within the family context. One of the things that's interesting related to this is that our memories of things do tend to soften over time. So oftentimes the things in our life that are the most negative will be looked at later on and seen through a different kind of a lens, a softer lens. So for example, if you at the time felt as if you were bullied or picked on mercilessly by your sibling, when you look back on it now, that takes on a softer tone. The bullying and the other kinds of mistreatment in your mind seem less harsh than they did at the time. Part of that is maturity, part of that is the passage of time. But there's another dynamic at work here as well for Jesse Delia. And that is that when we research selective memory, we find that those memories are hardened or softened over time to fit the current emotional state. So for example, if you and your sibling are still in some kind of a conflict today as emerging adults, or even as adults, if you have a negative feeling toward your sibling, then as you remember back to interactions with your sibling, you're more likely to think negatively about that interaction. Or to put it differently, because you have negative feelings now toward your sibling or toward your parents, then you superimpose those negative feelings on the memories you have that are associated with your siblings or your parents. Now, this is important because everybody thinks that when they talk with their family, they're talking about truth. After all, your memories of the 6th grade science project are truthful, at least so far as you're concerned. Your parents, on the other hand, have a different memory, yet to them, that memory is also truthful. Well, who's right? There's no way to know. And that's why Delia and most other researchers suggest not even trying to have conflicts over anything related to memory. Now, I've used some examples of parents and kids to talk about Delia's notion of selective memory, but that's not the only family context in which we see this notion of selective memory. We see it most commonly as well with husbands and wives. Spouses oftentimes have very different memories of the first time they met, or where their first date was, or what happened on their wedding, or who attended their wedding, or what surrounded the birth of their first child. What's interesting about this is that the selective memory oftentimes reveals what for us is the most important thing about that memory. So for instance, in the birth of a child, if a husband had promised that he would be right there by his wife's side all the way through the birth process, if he had stepped out to get a bite to eat, or if he had somehow stepped aside to watch a little television or take a break, the wife might really remember that and focus on that every time she tells the story of the child's birth at a gathering of friends. That rankles the husband a little bit because his memory is different. Yeah, he might have stepped out, but it wasn't that often and it wasn't for that long. And so he and the wife have a challenge over discerning the truth of this particular memory. It's selective. In his mind, to make himself look good, he might not recognize how often or how long he was gone. The wife, on the other hand, wanting to make a point about the husband not keeping his commitment to be a part of the delivery, emphasizes, perhaps to a greater extent, the fact that the husband was not there. Look, one of the best pieces of advice that Delia and other researchers can give is to never have conflict over anything regarding memories. Instead, you're far better off to simply let it go and leave it alone. Here's a second communicative dynamic that makes family communication somewhat unique. It's what's known as family rituals. In sociology or cultural anthropology, rituals are repetitive actions that a group of people engages in that have particular meaning attached to them. So, what we're talking about here are not just the easy things that happen as a regular part of a family's coming and going. So, for example, we're not just talking about the getting ready for work or getting ready for school rituals that take place in the morning. We are talking about those. So, if, for example, it's a ritual for mom to make sure her kids have the right lunch packed, or to make sure that they all have coats on before they go out the door, or if there's a ritual greeting or ritual expression of love before you leave the house, that is a family ritual. Now, there's not necessarily meaning endowed with that, so while that is a family ritual, and while those are often unique to families, that's not exactly the kind of thing we're always talking about. What we're talking about more properly are the kinds of things that families endow with a particular kind of meaning. So let me give you an example. I know someone back in Portland, Oregon, where I come from, where when the daughter was young, her mom, before tucking the daughter in for bed and making sure everything was all squared away for the night, she would brush her daughter's hair 50 times. And as the daughter sat there and the mom stood behind her, brushing her hair 50 strokes, the mom and the daughter would talk a little bit. And sometimes they were heartfelt conversations, sometimes they were silly, sometimes they were mundane. But that evening ritual of the stroking of the hair came to have great meaning, in particular for the mom. So as you might imagine, when the daughter grew up, she got to an age where she didn't want her mom to do that anymore. And her mom was heartbroken. Because you see, for the mom, the fact that this ritual was no longer going to occur was a very real, tangible indication that the daughter had grown up and that the mother and daughter would forever have a different relationship than they had previously. These family rituals are actually quite important. In fact, a lot of research finds a strong correlation between the presence of family rituals and a number of things that are actually quite helpful to a family dynamic. So, for example, one of the things we know is that the more family rituals people have, the more they tend to have fond memories when they look back on their childhood. We also know that families that have frequent and strong family rituals oftentimes indicate stronger bonds between members of the family. Those bonds are present not only when the children are growing up, but also later on in life when everyone becomes an adult. These family rituals are especially important in single family contexts. So if, for example, you have a situation where there's a single parent, whatever rituals are associated with raising the kids in that context, that ritual will take on even greater importance. Or to put it differently, if it's a single mom who's stroking her daughter's hair every night, that ritual will take on even more importance compared to that of the mom who's a family that is still intact. One of the things that's also neat about family rituals is that they oftentimes provide a forum for communication. So one of the more common family rituals is the evening meal. In fact, there's a lot of research that finds that families that share an evening meal together tend to have stronger bonds, tend to be healthier families, and their kids tend to have more positive social outcomes. But laying all that aside, one of the things we know is that many of these rituals, these family dinner rituals, allow an opportunity for kids and parents to communicate. Or even if there are no kids on the scene, it's just a husband and a wife, sitting down and sharing meals together becomes an important forum for communication. My wife and I, most evenings, will take our dog for a walk around the neighborhood. And during that 45-minute walk or so, it's an excellent opportunity for she and I to talk. And sometimes it's mundane, sometimes it's deep, sometimes it just is. Sometimes it's companionable silence for block after block. And all of that is okay. In fact, in the research, any of the three kinds of communicative interactions I just described on that walk have each been found to correlate with positive outcomes. So, if there was a word of advice to be given, if you find yourself in a family context, you're best off creating family rituals. Now, as you might imagine, those rituals are idiosyncratic. That is to say, they differ from family to family. The key is not so much what the ritual is, as much as it is that there is a ritual. And so, what we say about family ritual is that it's the kind of thing that, though it can occur spontaneously, it's far better off to actually happen with some kind of planning. And as you might imagine, the research finds that those rituals that are planned and that are attached with some kind of specific meaning are the ones that are most important. So, for example, Christmas traditions oftentimes are rife with meaning. I know a family back in Portland, Oregon, that every Christmas Eve the family gathers together and they read the Nativity story from Luke chapter 2. That is a Christmas tradition. Other families have a Christmas tradition of giving socks to one another on Christmas Eve. For some families, it's opening presents on Christmas Eve. Or for other families, it's having a particular kind of meal on Christmas Day. Well, holidays oftentimes open up all kinds of traditions. And what's happening then is that these rituals, these tradition-laden rituals, are endowed with a kind of meaning. And some of it can be quite silly. In Portland, Oregon, where I come from, there's a department store called Fred Meyer. It's actually a one-stop shop with groceries and clothing and automotive things and drugstore type stuff, a lot of stuff. But every year on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, they have the annual sock sale. It's 2-for-1 socks. And a lot of families in the Pacific Northwest, including my own, would go to the annual Black Friday sock sale at Fred Meyer. We'd go as a family. It was a great time. That particular ritual, that tradition, was endowed with meaning for us. And while those things I just described are not necessarily communicative, I mean, the going to the sock sale really isn't communicative, but it creates the opportunity to non-verbally communicate what's important for the family. And even though both of my kids are now grown, they think fondly back about that sock sale, and we'd all like to be able to go again. A third dynamic that makes family communication unique is what's known as family stories. And here we draw heavily on the research of Mark Vangelesti. Vangelesti is a researcher that has studied how it is people tell stories to one another and how those stories are helpful in creating meaning and in forging a relationship between people. For Vangelesti, stories play what he calls a referential function. That is to say, the stories refer to something. So the stories are about something. There's a beginning and a middle and an end to any story. But the story is referring to something larger. It's perhaps teaching a moral, or it's hearkening back a memory, or it's making a point, or it's differentiating one family from another family. Whatever else is happening for Vangelesti, these family stories are helpful in carving out boundaries. They're helpful in communicating something about the people involved in them or about the family that's just not about the story itself. Vangelesti goes so far as to say that these are a kind of family scrapbook that keep the memories of the family, that trace the history of the family, and that in many ways tell everyone both in and outside the family what the family is about. So, for example, my in-laws have this story about how on Thanksgiving dinner they were serving mashed potatoes. And one year there was a coin that had been inserted into the mashed potatoes. And the idea was that someone would find the coin and they'd receive a small prize. Well, everyone was told this, and so as they dipped into the mashed potatoes, they kept expecting to find the coin. And sure enough, they did, when one of them accidentally swallowed it. As you might imagine, it necessitated a trip to the emergency room and kind of ruined Thanksgiving. But that story has been told over and over again in the family, and it's told in such a way not just to make people smile and to give a little teasing to the person who swallowed the quarter, but it's also done to drive home a message, a kind of moral message, which is don't eat so quickly that you don't take time to savor the meal. Or alternatively, because of the person being teased being one of those people that's a little clumsy, that story is often told to reaffirm the idea that this person is clumsy. And so for Mark Vangelesti, if you listen carefully to the stories that families tell, you will learn a great deal about what the family values. You'll learn a great deal about the rules a family has, which we'll actually talk about later in this class. You'll learn a great deal, Vangelesti says, about how families conduct themselves, about what is proper and what's not proper, what the aspirations of a particular family are. In short, he wants you to listen carefully to the stories that are told so that way you'll understand more about the family. And remember, for Vangelesti, and for other researchers that study family stories, the content of the story is important, but how the story functions in the family is far more important. The way the story is told is more important. Is it told with a twinkle in the eye and a little bit of teasing? Is the story told with some vengeance or some bitterness? Is the story told in an offhand manner? Or is the story part of the ritual that occurs every time a particular holiday or anniversary or event happens to roll around? Now, earlier we talked about selective editing, which was Jesse Delia's, or selective memory, which is Jesse Delia's idea. An idea that kind of bridges Delia's idea of selective memory and Evangelisti's idea of family stories is what's called selective editing. Stories can be told and retold many times, and as you might imagine, oftentimes when a story is told, it's told differently. There are a little more or a little less detail, or there's something added that wasn't there before, or the story has a bit of a different tone to it than it did previously. Evangelisti and others find that when we tell stories about our family members, or when we tell stories in the context of a family, there's editing going on. We're leaving things out, we're adding things, we're embellishing things, we're shortening things, and we do that for a particular purpose. We do that because oftentimes that's highlighting something about the story. So let's jump into the research about spouses to give an example of what's going on here. One of the things we know is that if you listen carefully to the stories spouses tell about each other, you can get a very good picture of the general status of the health of that spouse's relationship at that given point in time. So if you've got John and Mary are telling stories about the time when John didn't know how to do laundry, and so right after their honeymoon ended, John threw all the clothes of reds and blues and whites and yellows and greens into the same washing machine, turned on the washing machine, hot rinse, hot wash, lots of detergent, and it turned everything that was white a shade of pink. Now, that story's been told to John and Mary's friends many, many times. But one of the things that Mary does when she tells that story is she leaves out the part of the story where she had told John specifically how to do laundry, and John ignored her. Instead, when she tells the story and pokes a little fun at John, but she always ends it by saying, "But you know, I was so grateful to have a husband that wanted to help out with the chores around the house, because I know a lot of my friends whose husbands wouldn't lift a finger to help them out." So in the way the story is told, the selective editing that Mary engages in makes John look good. It's a positive kind of a story that actually affirms something about John's character that Mary wants to underscore to her friends. And so what we say then is that the editing, just like the selective memory, just like the story itself, is very revealing of what's going on in a family. Now, if I were you, and I wanted to get the most out of this class, at this exact moment I'd be asking myself, what stories do I tell to my roommates about my family? What stories do the people in my family tell about one another? What do we remember, either selectively or otherwise? What's edited, and why is it edited? If you're honest with yourself, you'll be able to answer a lot of these questions. And if you think about it deeply, you'll realize that oftentimes this is about that. Or to put it differently, this story is really about something else. And so family stories become really important for better understanding a story. Let me give you one final derivative of this notion of family stories. It comes from a researcher named Edward Stone. And Stone wants to focus specifically about how stories act as a kind of socialization tool. Now, a socialization tool is anything that helps pass along important values and messages from one person or one generation to another. Well, clearly, in a family context, parents are involved in using socialization tools to teach their kids the right way to behave, or to teach their kids what's valuable, to teach their kids what they should or should not do. And in the research that Stone has conducted, he finds that families in particular make extensive use of these kinds of stories. In fact, there's a biblical basis to this. In the Old Testament, the children of Israel are told by God to tell stories to one another about the history of this nation, this Israelite nation, in order to better understand God's relationship with them and how it is they are to conduct themselves because they're God's people. Even to this day, in Bible study, Sunday school, all across the world, many in the Christian faith tradition use the stories of the Bible as a way to try and teach kids how they are to behave. Well, families do the same thing, but families do it differently and oftentimes more powerfully than do other contexts. So, for example, you and your friends don't typically tell a lot of stories that indicate how you are to behave. Families, however, they do it all the time. And in fact, there's much research that finds that some of the most effective parents at passing on their Christian faith to the subsequent generation, to their kids, are those parents that make extensive use of stories. Now, let me connect the dot between this idea and something we talked about in a previous video. In a previous video, we talked about this idea that oftentimes parents believe that their wisdom puts them in a position to properly parent their kids, but their kids discount that wisdom by believing that the world has changed and the world today is sufficiently different that the parent's wisdom is less useful, less credible than it used to be. Well, that connects to this idea here of the stories that are told, because one of the challenges that parents face in using these stories as a socialization tool is that the kids oftentimes discount them because they think the story either is remembered differently, or they think the story is outdated, or they think they're special and they think the story won't apply to them. Now, that shouldn't surprise you because that's human nature, but in a family setting where socialization is so important, Stone finds that these family stories become really important as methods of trying to raise kids in the way that parents would like to have them raised. Now, in a spousal context, stories aren't nearly as common and frankly not nearly as important. It's not to say that husbands and wives don't have stories they can tell and that those stories can be a socialization kind of thing. It's just that with spouses, it's far less common. And so really it's more a parent tool than it is a spouse tool. But nonetheless, it is something that makes family communication rather unique. The next concept that floats around families that makes them rather unique compared to other contexts are what are known as family secrets. I'll bet your family has some secrets. Every family has some secrets. Some are big, some are small, but every family has them. And again, that's not to say there aren't secrets in romantic dating relationships, nor is it to say that there are no secrets in a friendship. It's just that family relationships, because of their nature, because of their length, they tend to have a lot of secrets. Or alternatively, the secrets the family does have tend to be really important ones. Naima Brown Smith is the foremost researcher who studied the role of secrets in family communication. And she says that there are several different ways to look at the secrets that families hold. One lens through which to see these secrets is to ask who controls the information. Or to put it differently, who knows the secret and who doesn't. So for example, if your parents both have a secret, let's say that they've always told everyone that they were married before their first child was born, but in reality that's not the case. In reality, they had not been married before the child was born. No one ever checked on that, no one ever bothered to talk about it, but it's kind of a secret. So the two parents, the spouses, husband and wife, they know that, the kids don't know that, and let's just say that the wife is scared to death that the kids are going to find out. It's interesting that Brown Smith wants to say the important thing to focus on is who has the information and who doesn't, because by knowing why it is that they so desperately want to keep that information to themselves, you'll know something about the spouses. In this case, if the kids were to be made aware of that, the mom is desperately concerned that that might lower her status in the eyes of her children, that it might erode the credibility she has in trying to instill morals in her kids. And so whoever controls the information tends to have more power than those that don't have the information. A second way to see family secrets, of course, is to ask, what's the secret about? In the example I gave you a minute ago, I said the mom is concerned that the information gets out to the kids because the mom feels that she would be made to look bad if the information got out. Well, why would that be? Because having a child before marriage is the kind of thing that the mom believes ought not to be done. It is, at least to some degree, in the mom's eyes, shameful. And so for Naima Brown Smith, the nature of the secret oftentimes will tell you what a family values. Or to put it differently, you show me what your family wants to keep secret, and I'll show you what it is they value. So for instance, oftentimes Christian parents raise kids in a Christian environment, but then when the kid becomes an emerging adult or even an adult, they fall away from their faith. They renounce their Christian beliefs, or they stop going to church. They become hostile perhaps toward God. Well, for many Christian families, this is rather embarrassing. It's the kind of thing that calls into question their ability as parents. It's the kind of thing they would rather people not know about. And so there's much research that finds that oftentimes if one or two of your adult children are not faithful to the Lord, Christian families will simply cease to talk about them. So, for example, if a hypothetical family, let's call them the Johnsons, have 3 kids, and 2 of them are faithful, they're regular church attenders, Christianity is important in their life, but the third one is not. The third one has renounced belief in God, never goes to church, and in fact thinks that most Christians are hypocrites. So when the Johnsons are talking to their friends, rather at church or anywhere else, they'll talk more often about their 2 kids that are faithful and less often about the one that is not. And if they do talk about the one that is not, the research finds that parents oftentimes tend to dodge the questions that are asked about that third child who is not faithful. That's just one example of how it's the presence of a secret and it's the nature of the secret that reveal what's important to a family. And so if I were a student in this class right now, I'd be asking myself, hey, what secrets does my family hold? Why are they secret? What does that say about my family? And if the secret were widely known, what would happen? The answer to those questions will lead you to understanding how it is that the secrets function within that family. So let me give you one more way to think about these family secrets. Ask yourself the question, who knows the secret? You see, Naima Brown Smith says that oftentimes knowing a secret about a family can be a way of affirming one's membership in the family. Or to put it differently, if you know the secret that a family holds, you're probably in. You're on the inside. You're not other. You're not on the outside. So, kind of a stereotypic example of this is from the movie The Godfather. In the movie The Godfather, one of Don Corleone's sons is dating someone who is outside the family, obviously, but really knows very little about what the family does. She doesn't really know the family is deeply connected to the Italian mafia, has no idea that they're involved in prostitution and drugs and extortion and racketeering and all this other stuff. And so, as she comes to get to know this young man, the son of Don Corleone, she begins to sense some things. But one of the things the family wants to do is make sure to never discuss business at the dinner table. And they want to make sure that some of the secrets about the family are not made known. Well, as the movie unfolds, and in particular in one of the sequels, she comes to understand very clearly what many of the family's secrets are. And now that she knows those secrets, she's full in the family. And so for Naima Brown Smith, who knows the secret also is a way of indicating who's in the family. And so full membership of the family oftentimes comes with a complete knowledge of what that secret happens to be. Well, the next idea we'll talk about is a pretty common idea that many families experience on a regular basis. It's the concept of teasing. Now, we'll talk about teasing at a couple of different points in this class, but I wanted to set apart teasing as one topic of conversation in this particular video, and here's why. Teasing is among the most universal kinds of communication in a family setting. And again, it's not to say that friendships don't tease or that workplace relationships don't tease, because clearly they do. But the extent of teasing is far greater in a family context than any other. And, quite frankly, other than some school-based kinds of bully situations, the negative effects of teasing are far greater in a family context than any other context. So what do we know as a concept about teasing? Well, teasing is oftentimes used in many different ways. If you just think about your own family context, ask yourself, how does my family tease? Well, some families use teasing as a way to resolve conflicts. Some families use teasing as a way to bond together. Some families use teasing as a way to put yourself into a hierarchy within the family. Some families use teasing because that's just the kind of humor that they have. Teasing can serve any or all of those functions and be quite helpful in a family dynamic. But here's the thing about teasing. Teasing requires interpretation. It's like sarcasm. You have to understand that someone is being sarcastic or you'll take it the wrong way. In a similar manner, you have to understand that people are teasing or you'll take it the wrong way. But here's an important difference between sarcasm and teasing. The hurt that accompanies teasing oftentimes is far greater than the hurt that accompanies sarcasm. Here's why. Because people tend to tease about things that are close to the heart of the people that are being teased. Earlier, in this video, I mentioned a family member who might be particularly clumsy. So if the other members of the family tease this family member about her clumsiness, then that begins to strike a nerve with this person. And so the more teasing there is, the more likely it is that the person who's clumsy, who's receiving the teasing, is going to be hurt by that. You have to interpret it in the way that makes the most sense. And unfortunately, with respect to teasing, most of the time, though people might intend for it to be taken in a lighthearted manner, the research suggests that many people take it quite the opposite. In fact, here's what we could say with respect to comparing sarcasm to teasing. With respect to sarcasm, people tend to have a pretty broad range of sarcasm that they can put up with. Or to put it differently, I can put up with this much sarcasm before it really begins to do a lot of damage to me. With teasing, on the other hand, it's not as great a range. People can typically put up with less teasing before it begins to be hurtful to them. Now, that's not to say that you should be more sarcastic, because there's enough of a problem with sarcasm in a family as well. In fact, we'll talk about that later on in this course. But for now, grab a hold of the idea that from a negative context, teasing is more likely to bring about a negative context and to bring about a more potent negative context than is sarcasm. But like sarcasm, you have to interpret it. Sometimes people will say, I love, therefore I tease. And fine, fair enough. It might be that you're offering an interpretive cue to try and help people understand how they should take the teasing. But at the end of the day, the reality is you're still being teased. And for many people, that teasing still hurts deeply. Sometimes people tease as an expression of power, and when you're on the receiving end of that teasing and you're having reaffirmed for you your relative lack of power, that can hurt. Sometimes teasing can be a way of saving face, and that's fine too, but oftentimes that saving face comes at the expense of someone else. Finally, we know some things about teasing that are interesting because they're related to gender differences. Anytime I talk about gender differences in any of my classes, I have to add a couple of caveats. The first of which is to say that just because I say that males are more likely to do X or females are more likely to do Y, that does not necessarily mean it's going to be true in every context. The research about gender differences refers to the aggregate. Whenever you put a particular person's name on it, like Brian Simmons or Judy Smith, what's true of males or females may or may not be true of those particular individuals. It's simply trying to say, in the aggregate, this is what the tendency of males is. Second caveat is to say this. Obviously, because each situation is different, the situation might be more important in determining the way a particular communication interaction works out, more so than the gender of the people involved in that communicative interaction. So, for example, while it may be true that females are more likely to apologize than males, it's also true that a given context might make it more likely that a male is more likely to apologize, or that a particular male is more likely to apologize. So with that as a backdrop, what do we know about the research regarding teasing and gender? Well, generally speaking, males will tease more frequently than females do. In a family context, this means that every male, brothers, husbands, uncles, anybody, is more likely to tease than are the female members of that family. Now, that's a comparative statement. That's not to say that females in a family never tease. It's just to say that, comparatively speaking, males are teasing more often. That's because for many males, humor is more central to their identity than it is for females. Many males find that humor is an easy way to win influence and to put themselves in a relatively more powerful, more favorable position. If I can tease you and get away with it, I've put you at a lower level than I am. And so in doing so, I feel as if I've gained some kind of status. It's also true that for many males, teasing is a ritual for building relationships. Look, for whatever reason, from the time males are very young, teasing becomes a way to bond. And so that carries forward into the adult years. It's one reason why many fathers will tease both their sons and their daughters, because it's almost a kind of love language. And fair enough, for many families, teasing is a love language, and it can be healthy. But the reality is that oftentimes the teasing has unhealthy undertones, or the teasing can go too far, or the kind of teasing a father and daughter might have engaged in when the daughter was younger didn't have negative effects. But now that the daughter is an adolescent, the teasing stings a little more. Father doesn't realize that. The teasing becomes the one language he feels he can speak toward his daughter, so he continues speaking it and continues to hurt her unbeknownst to him. Of course, we know that females compared to males are more likely to be bothered by the teasing they receive. And I say, of course, because the kinds of dynamics we talked about a moment ago, about establishing yourself in a hierarchy, about teasing being a common means of bonding, they're just not as common in the way that females interact. And because of those two things, it makes sense then that females would experience a greater negative impact to the teasing than they would otherwise. It has nothing to do with hormones, has nothing to do with chromosomes, has nothing to do with gender roles. It has everything to do with the patterns of communication, the socialization patterns that are present in male and females as they are raised in this country. And again, remember, to put a particular female's name on it, what I've just shared may or may not be the case. Finally, with respect to gender and teasing, we can say that females do tease less often than males do. And in part, this becomes important because if females are teasing less often than males, oftentimes females expect others to acquiesce to their desired means of communication. Females, for example, in a family context, are far more likely to be cognizant of the idea that you shouldn't tease your brother because you're siblings, or you're my husband, you're not supposed to tease me. And so therefore, females not only become a little more aware of the possible negative effects of teasing, they oftentimes are grounding that more so in these familial roles than are the males in their family. Well, family communication is unique in so many different ways, and the past two videos have tried to drive home some of the broader concepts that researchers have identified that make communication in the family setting unique. In future videos, we'll explore some of these topics in greater detail and show how they're connected to other considerations of family communication.